Tunisia, in North Africa, in the spring of 1943, is not a place where a tank crew expects miracles. The heat sits on the rocky hills like a heavy blanket, and the air shimmers over the stones. On top of a mountain the British call Long Stop Hill, a German crew inside a Panzer IV is watching the valley below. They are calm, almost bored, because the slope beneath them is so steep and broken that no sane tanker would ever try to climb it. A man would struggle to walk up that hillside without using his hands, and a Sherman tank would simply spin its tracks and slide backwards in humiliation. Even the mighty Tiger, the terror of every Allied crew, would strip its gears and cook its clutch if it tried to force a way up. The German commander knows this, and that knowledge makes him feel safe. Up here, with an excellent field of fire and the laws of physics on his side, he feels untouchable. Then he hears a sound that does not fit his mental picture of the battle. At first it is only a distant grinding, the metallic scream of steel teeth chewing rock somewhere far below the ridge. The sound grows louder, closer, angrier, until even inside the armored shell of the Panzer it drills into the men's nerves. The commander lifts his binoculars and looks down, expecting to see a Sherman or maybe a light Stuart struggling on the lower slopes. What he actually sees makes him laugh. Crawling out of the dust like some prehistoric animal is a shape that has no right to be on a modern battlefield. It is boxy and tall, with tiny road wheels buried deep under a long skirt of track that wraps almost completely around the hull. The thing is barely moving, creeping forward at the pace of an old man with a bad leg. To the German crew it looks less like a weapon and more like an agricultural tractor that has somehow gotten lost in a war. They open fire. 75mm shells scream down from the ridge, slamming into the strange British tank's front armor. Each hit throws up a flash and a cloud of dust. But when the smoke clears, the tank is still there, still grinding its way upward. The shells are bouncing, gouging steel and stripping paint, but they are not going through. Slowly, almost casually, the ugly machine continues to climb. Its tracks claw into the rock at an angle that makes the Germans' stomachs tighten just from looking at it. The tank's nose points at the sky, its engine howls, and yet it keeps dragging itself higher, rock by rock, like a steel mountain goat. The laughter inside the Panzer turret dies away, because this is not just a ridiculous-looking tank anymore. This is something that should not be able to exist, doing something that should not be possible. That clumsy shape is a Churchill, and on that day in Tunisia, the German army begins to understand a brutal truth. They built tanks for speed and long-range duels. The British built a monster that could go where no other machine on Earth could follow. This is not the story of the fastest tank of the Second World War, and it is not the story of the biggest gun on the battlefield. This is the story of the relic that refused to die. The tank that was born a failure, disgraced in its first battle, and yet somehow became the steel bulldog that would hunt tigers in their own lairs. To understand how such a strange beast ever came to exist, we have to go back to a moment of pure British panic. In May of 1940, the British Army had just been kicked off the continent at Dunkirk. Hundreds of tanks and thousands of vehicles were left burning or abandoned on French roads and beaches. Britain suddenly found itself almost naked in the face of a possible German invasion. The government needed tanks, and it needed them yesterday. There was no time for elegant design studies or patient testing. A desperate order went out to Vauxhall Motors, a company whose main experience was building family cars and delivery trucks. The instructions they received from the War Office already belonged to another war. Many senior officers were still thinking in the language of trenches, shell craters, and barbed wire from 1918. They told the engineers, in effect, speed is optional. The ability to cross ditches, torn up ground, and deep mud is everything. They did not ask for a fast cruiser that could race around enemy flanks. They asked for a rolling fortress that could crawl over the wreckage of the last war. So the engineers reached back into the past. They sketched a tank with tiny wheels hidden under long side skirts, and with tracks that wrapped high up around the hull so it could lever itself out of trenches. The prototype that rolled out after only a few frantic weeks of work did not look like a weapon from the age of Panthers and T-34s. It looked like a cousin of the lumbering British tanks that had first appeared on the Somme. Its official name at the factory was A-22, but soon it would carry a far heavier label, Churchill, after the new Prime Minister himself. On paper, the idea had some logic. The armor was thick for its time, a solid wall of steel meant to shrug off the short-barreled guns still common in the German panzer force. But the main gun in the turret was a tiny 2-pounder that could punch holes in light armor, yet struggled badly against the heavier Panzer III and Panzer IV. Even worse than the gun was the heart beating inside the hull. Britain simply did not have a ready-made tank engine powerful enough to move this new heavy infantry tank. Aircraft engines existed, but the Air Force guarded them like treasure and refused to share. So the designers at Vauxhall made a desperate choice. They went to the truck division and pulled a standard Bedford 6-cylinder engine off the line, an honest little unit that produced around 170 horsepower in a lorry. For a tank, that was hopelessly weak. Their solution was pure Frankenstein. They took 2 of those truck engines, bolted them together side by side, and created an improvised flat 12, the Bedford Twin 6. On the test bench, it made more power, but it also produced new problems, with vibration, heat, and oil flow that nobody truly had time to solve. The cooling system had been designed for a truck racing along a road with cool air rushing past the radiator, not for a tank crawling at walking speed through sticky mud. When the first Churchills drove under their own power, crews quickly learned what that meant. Engines overheated so badly that the floor plates inside the driver's compartment grew almost too hot to stand on. Oil leaked, seals blew, and gearbox components sheared under the stress of moving so much armor with so little power. In some early trials, a Churchill could barely manage 4 miles before grinding to a shuddering halt. Tankers joked grimly about placing bets on whether they would reach the firing range or burst into flames on the way there. Yet Britain was desperate, and desperation rarely waits for perfection. Despite all the technical warnings, the Churchill went into mass production. Hundreds of these flawed machines rolled out to units that had little choice but to accept them. Very soon, the new tank would be thrown into a battle that would almost kill its reputation forever. On the 19th of August, 1942, the Allies launched a large raid on the French port of Dieppe. The plan was to test German defenses and gain experience for a future full-scale invasion. The heavy stars of this rehearsal were 29 Churchill tanks of the Calgary Regiment. They were supposed to storm ashore, crush obstacles under their tracks, and act as moving bunkers for the Canadian infantry. It went wrong almost immediately. The beach at Dieppe was not fine sand, but a thick layer of smooth, rounded stones known as chert. As the Churchills rumbled off their landing craft, their heavy tracks dug into the loose surface and began to sink. The stones rolled like ball bearings under the steel, spinning the tracks in place and dragging the tanks down by the nose. Some Churchills bogged so deeply that their bellies scraped the rocks. Others became high-centered. Almost all of them lost precious minutes, struggling just to move a few yards. Above them, German guns on the cliffs stared down at a perfect shooting gallery. Anti-tank guns and artillery opened up, hammering the stranded British tanks and the exposed infantry around them. And yet, in this catastrophe, the first hint of the Churchills' strange strength appeared. Shell after shell smashed into the tanks, taking out tracks, jamming turrets, and destroying guns. But many of the crews did not die. Inside their thick armor boxes, they survived blows that would have turned a faster, thinner-skinned machine into a funeral pyre. For hours, some of the crippled Churchills acted as immovable steel pillboxes on the beach. They fired their machine guns until the ammunition ran dry, providing the only real cover for shattered infantry units pinned against the sea. When the order finally came to retreat, most of those tanks were abandoned where they lay. Of the 29 Churchills that landed, 27 were lost. The Germans photographed themselves standing on the wrecks, laughing at the crude, riveted armor and strange shape of the British heavy tank. Their reports dismissed it as obsolete, slow, and poorly armed. Back in Britain, the reaction was icy rage. Critics in the army and in Parliament demanded that the Churchill program be scrapped immediately. The new American Sherman was arriving, and compared to the lumbering A-22, it looked sleek and modern. The Sherman was faster, more reliable, and easier to ship and maintain. Many officers argued that Britain should simply abandon the Churchill and standardize on the American design. For a brief moment, the fate of the tank seemed sealed. But there was one man who was not prepared to let a machine bearing his name die so easily. Winston Churchill looked very carefully at the reports from Dieppe. He saw the horrible casualties among the infantry, and he saw the shocking number of tanks knocked out. Yet he also saw a line item that others had ignored. The crews inside the Churchills had survived in far higher numbers than expected. The thick armor, clumsy and heavy as it was, had done exactly what it was supposed to do. The tank had failed as a mobile weapon, but succeeded as a shield. Churchill argued that the battles still to come, in North Africa, in Italy, and eventually in Germany itself, would include mountains, bad weather, and fortifications where slow but tough machines might be priceless. He forced the Army to give the design one last chance. A small experimental unit named King Force was created, built around 6 improved Churchill Mach III tanks. Engineers worked frantically to strengthen the transmission, adjust the cooling systems, and replace the old 2-pounder with a harder-hitting 6-pounder gun. These upgraded heavies were then shipped to North Africa in time for the Battle of El Alamein. In the rough ground and wadis of the desert, something unexpected happened. Shermans and Crusaders, with their narrower tracks, struggled in deep sand and on broken rocks. The Churchill, with its long track run and unusual suspension, actually coped better than its faster cousins.
crews began to realize that this ugly machine could grind forward through fields and gullies that other tanks had to avoid. The real test came in the rocky hills where our story began. Lieutenant Gudgeon and other Churchill commanders found themselves facing the nightmare shape of the Tiger,
the German heavy tank armed with the fearsome 88mm gun. In one famous engagement near a hill known as Jebel Jaffa, a Churchill troop blundered into the sights of Tiger No. 131. A single shot from the Tiger tore through the first Churchill's armor and forced the crew to bail out, stunned but alive. Yet the remaining Churchills did not flee. Using the broken ground as cover, they crawled up the slopes, refusing to present an easy long-range target. One managed to get close enough to fire into the Tiger's turret ring, jamming the traverse. Suddenly, the mighty German heavy could not turn its gun. Facing slow, armored beasts that kept crawling closer no matter how the rocks and mud tried to stop them, the Tiger's crew lost their nerve. They abandoned their nearly intact tank and ran. When British troops reached the hulking German machine, They found it still largely functional. Tiger 131 became the first running Tiger captured by Western allies, a priceless intelligence prize that would later star in museum displays and even in films. And it had not been trapped by a fast cruiser or a specialized tank destroyer. It had been cornered by the supposed relic of Dieppe, the Churchill. While British crews were beginning to respect their odd vehicle, another set of tankers far to the east were forming their own harsh opinion. As part of Lend-Lease, Britain sent several hundred Churchills to the Soviet Union in 1942. The Red Army tankers who unloaded them in the Arctic ports were used to the T-34, a sleek, sloped machine with wide tracks and a powerful diesel engine. To those men, the tall, slab-sided Churchill looked like a step backwards. They saw narrow tracks that threatened to sink into deep snow, complicated mechanical systems that would hate the Russian winter, and an underpowered engine that drank precious fuel. They gave the British tank a black-humored nickname, the Grave for Five Brothers. In the brutal cold, some of the early Churchills did struggle. Hydraulic fluids thickened, engines coughed, and the heavy hulls bogged in deep drifts. But when fighting moved into towns and close-range ambushes, a different picture emerged. At Kursk and in other savage battles, Soviet reports noted how often T-34s brewed up when hit at short distances by German guns. Their medium armor and diesel fuel could not always save them from catastrophic fires. The Churchill, slow and clumsy as it was, took punishment that would have killed a lighter vehicle and still kept its crew alive. One Soviet assessment from a Guards tank unit summed it up bluntly. The English tank is slow and ugly, but the crew survives, and a surviving crew can fight again tomorrow. By 1944, some Soviet heavy units specifically requested Churchills for brutal street fighting, where surviving the first hit mattered more than getting to the battle quickly. Back in Britain, meanwhile, engineers and one very imaginative general were about to turn the Churchill from a mere tank into a whole circus of bizarre armored machines. General Percy Hobart, famously eccentric and brilliantly practical, was given the job of solving a terrible problem. The Allies were planning to land in Normandy, and the German Atlantic Wall was lined with bunkers, gun positions, minefields, and tank traps. Standard Shermans and Cromwells could not simply drive up to those defenses and shoot them apart. They would be blown to pieces long before they got close enough. Hobart needed specialized engineering tanks, vehicles that could lay bridges, clear mines, smash concrete, and do a dozen other suicidal jobs. For that role, the stable, heavy Churchill chassis was perfect. It did not need to be fast. It needed to be strong and capable of carrying ridiculous equipment without tipping over. So Hobart's division began modifying Churchills into what the troops would soon call Hobart's Funnies. One Churchill variant became the ARK, a tank with no turret at all, just folding ramps along its top. It would drive into a ditch or up to a wall, lower its ramps, and literally become a living bridge for other vehicles. Another carried a giant spool of reinforced canvas on its nose, the bobbin, able to unroll a temporary road over soft sand or mud so that following units did not bog down. The most brutal of the engineering conversions was the AVRE, the Armored Vehicle Royal Engineers. In this version, the normal gun was removed and replaced with a stubby 290mm mortar called the petard. Its ammunition was a huge, squat demolition bomb nicknamed the Flying Dustbin because it looked like a metal trash can. The range was pitiful, only about 80 yards, which meant the crew had to drive almost up to the enemy bunker's doorstep before firing. But when the Flying Dustbin hit, the effect was biblical. The massive charge could shatter thick reinforced concrete, collapsing bunkers and blasting open tank obstacles with a single shot. What no field gun could do from a mile away, a Churchill AVRE could accomplish at spitting distance. Even that, however, was not the most feared Churchill of the war. That title belonged to a variant that turned the tank into a walking flame storm, the Churchill Crocodile. From the front, a Crocodile looked like any other Churchill with a normal 75mm gun. Enemy troops who had not been briefed often did not recognize the danger immediately. The secret was behind the tank, in a heavy armored trailer trundling along on two small wheels. Inside that trailer were roughly 400 gallons of thickened fuel and several large cylinders of compressed nitrogen gas. A protected pipe ran from the trailer under the tank, up through the hull, and out through a projector mounted where the Hull machine gun used to sit. When the commander pressed his trigger, the gas pressurized the fuel to enormous pressure and hurled a jet of burning liquid out to a range of 100 yards or more. The engineering was terrifyingly elegant. The fuel mixture was sticky, clinging to anything it touched. The projector could fire short bursts or long streams, allowing the crew to rake trenches, bunker embrasures, and even the sides of buildings. Crocodile crews developed a chilling tactic they called wet and hot shots. First, they would fire unlit fuel, a wet shot, splashing the outside of a bunker or trench with gallons of the thick liquid. The smell alone was enough to send a wave of dread through the men inside, who knew exactly what was about to happen. Then, after a pause heavy with fear, the commander would send a single hot shot, igniting the fuel already clinging to concrete and uniforms. The resulting firestorm could suck the oxygen out of a position as surely as it burned it. It was so horrifying that in some battles, German defenders surrendered as soon as they saw Crocodile's trailer appear on the road. At the fortress of Brest, and in other stubborn strongpoints, entire garrisons laid down their arms after just one demonstration burst against an outer wall. The price of wielding such a weapon was high. Crocodile crews knew that if their trailer was hit and the fuel exploded, their tank could become a crematorium. Enemy soldiers were often ordered to give no quarter to captured flamethrower operators, yet many Churchill men quietly preferred this assignment because if the enemy surrendered early, fewer of their own infantry would die storming those bunkers by hand. While Crocodiles and AVREs smashed fortifications in France, standard gun-armed Churchills were fighting their own brutal war in Italy. The campaign up the Italian peninsula was defined by rivers, steep hills, mud, and carefully prepared German defensive lines. This was perhaps the worst possible place for fast, lightly armored tanks designed for the open plains. Shermans and other mediums struggled on narrow mountain tracks. They slipped off icy roads or bogged down in deep mud, their weight concentrated on relatively narrow tracks. The Churchills, on the other hand, with their low center of gravity and sprawling track length, could grind up slopes that seemed designed for mules rather than machines. In the fighting along the Gothic line, there are photos of Churchills perched on ridges and peaks that look almost impossible. Crews would nose their tanks up precarious paths, their engines howling in low gear, while sappers chopped away rock and trees ahead of them. German defenders, who had confidently placed guns to sweep the valleys, suddenly found British heavies smashing through walls behind them. But even Italy was not the final demonstration of what the Churchill could do when the ground turned against everyone. That came in February of 1945, in the dark, flooded woods of the Reichswald on the German border. Operation Veritable was supposed to be a hammer blow into the German defenses on the Lower Rhine. Then the rain arrived and turned much of the forest into a swamp. Mud lay 3 feet deep in many clearings, and most of the tracks marked on the maps dissolved into chocolate-colored rivers. Montgomery and his staff looked at the conditions and realized that conventional armor would be nearly useless. So they did something audacious. They gathered roughly 500 Churchills, the largest concentration of heavy infantry tanks ever assembled. German planners had assumed that no vehicles could cross the soaked fields and forest floors, so they mined and fortified the roads while leaving much of the boggy ground comparatively bare. When the attack began, the Churchills ignored the roads altogether. They plunged straight into the mud. The wide track run and immense torque of their gearing allowed them to plow through sludge that swallowed men to the waist. Slowly, almost painfully, they pushed forward, dragging themselves between trees and over ditches that would have swallowed a lighter tank to its turret ring. German soldiers later spoke of ghost tanks appearing out of the mist in places where no tracked vehicle should ever have been able to operate. In the Reichswald, the Churchill did not just fight German armor, it fought the earth itself and won. The same slow, clumsy qualities that had seemed like unforgivable flaws on the pebbles of Dieppe became decisive strengths in the mud of Germany. By the end of the European War, the Churchill had done something very few designs could claim. It had served, in one form or another, from the desperate early days after Dunkirk all the way to the final offensives on German soil. And still its story was not over. 5 years later, the world slid into another brutal conflict, this time on the mountains and rice fields of Korea. In 1950, North Korean forces, supported by the Soviet Union, invaded the South with columns of T-34-85s. On paper, these were far superior to the aging British heavies left in inventory. The T-34 was faster, carried a powerful 85mm gun, and represented a newer generation of design. Yet when British units deployed to Korea, they brought Churchill tanks with them, including some Crocodiles. Once again, landscape and tactics changed the rules. In narrow valleys and on steep ridges, sheer mobility over bad ground mattered more than raw top speed on a flat road.
Reports from battles like the Emden River mention Churchill crews holding key positions under terrifying pressure. In one often told story, a Churchill Crocodile found itself swarmed by enemy infantry who tried to climb onto the hull and pry open the hatches. Instead of panicking, the commander calmly rotated the turret and fired the flamethrower in a circle around his own tank. The thick armor shielded the crew from most of the heat and splash, while the attackers around the hull were driven away in an instant wall of fire. Korea would be the Churchills' last war. By the early 1950s, newer designs, especially the emerging Centurion main battle tank, finally pushed the old infantry heavy into retirement. Before the curtain falls completely, though,
there is one more chapter worth telling, a glimpse of the monster the Churchill might have become. British engineers knew very well that even with all its courage, the standard Churchill was outgunned by the latest German heavies. The 6-pounder and 75mm guns struggled badly against the thick frontal armor of Panthers and King Tigers. The obvious solution was to mount the superb 17-pounder anti-tank gun on the Churchill chassis. But there was a problem. The turret ring of the existing tank was too small to take such a massive weapon and its recoil system. So designers sketched a heavily enlarged Churchill, wider and heavier, with a new turret big enough for the gun. The result was the A-43, known as the Black Prince. It had armor thicker than a Tiger I and a gun capable of killing any German tank from respectable distances. On paper, it was a King Tiger killer wearing a British uniform. Unfortunately, in one crucial respect, it was still a Churchill. It used essentially the same underpowered engine. Trying to push a 50-ton Black Prince with the same 350 horsepower that had already struggled in lighter marks produced a cruel joke. The prototype's top speed on a good road was barely more than 11 miles an hour, and off-road it crawled so slowly that walking infantry could keep up without breaking a sweat. By the time the Black Prince was ready to be tested, the war in Europe was ending. The British Army, looking ahead, chose instead to invest in the far more modern Centurion, which combined mobility, armor, and firepower in a balanced package. Only a handful of Black Prince prototypes were ever built, and the line ended there. So what, in the end, is the verdict on the Churchill? On a simple comparison chart, it loses many battles. It was slower than almost every contemporary medium tank. Its early reliability was awful, and its gun was often outmatched by newer enemy armor. Yet wars are not decided by numbers on trading cards. They are decided by whether a machine can do the nasty, specific jobs history demands of it. And in that harsher court, the Churchill stands taller than its awkward silhouette suggests. It was the tank that stood on pebble beaches and refused to burn long enough to shelter broken infantry at Dieppe. It was the tank that clawed its way up Tunisian rocks to stare down tigers on their own high ground. It was the tank that became a bridge, a bunker buster, and a rolling dragon breathing fire across the Atlantic wall. It was the tank that climbed Italian mule tracks and dragged itself through German swamp forests when every other vehicle had surrendered to the mud. It was the tank that, 5 years after Hitler died, was still holding lines on distant Korean hills against a new generation of Soviet steel. Veterans who served in both Shermans and Churchills often put it in simple human terms. The Sherman, they said, was like a racing car, fast, responsive, even fun, until the exact moment it hit a wall. The Churchill was a bulldog. It was not pretty, it was not quick, but once it bit into a position or a hill, It simply would not let go. The Churchill arrived in the Second World War looking like a relic from the last one. Some people tried to cancel it, bury it, and forget it. Instead, through a mixture of stubborn engineering, brutal battlefield lessons, and raw necessity, it turned into something unique. It became the relic that refused to die. And that is why, even in a world that worships sleek panthers and legendary tigers, the Churchill deserves its own place in the front row of history's armored giants. As you leave this story, imagine one last scene. On a cold museum floor somewhere, a tiger and a Churchill sit quietly side by side. One is famous for fear. The other is remembered by the men whose lives it actually saved. If you want to know how the British finally answered the big cats with their own killer gun, there is another chapter waiting. The story of the Firefly, the ordinary Sherman that learned how to blow a king tiger's turret sky high. Click into that story next, or step sideways and see how the mighty king tiger really compares to this stubborn British bulldog. Either way, the War of Steel is far from over, and there are many more beasts waiting in the dark.